Hey guys, in this video we're going to take another look at Latin verbs, and specifically we're going to look at the principal parts. So the question we're trying to answer is, why do Latin verbs have so many pieces when we look them up in the dictionary? Right? If you were to get a vocab list that included Latin verbs, you'd see that there's 4 pieces to it. So we're just trying to figure out, what are these, what do they mean, and why do we get 4 different forms of a Latin verb when you look it up in the dictionary? It's as simple as that. So before we do anything, we want to dive in with this question: what is a verb? And I've asked this question in a few of my videos, but it's important to make sure that we understand. It's an action word, right? Running, jumping, climbing, raining. All of these are verbs. It could be something, simple like to type or to launch. Any sort of action word is going to be a verb, just like in English, same thing in Latin. So again, when you look up a Latin verb in the dictionary, right? So maybe you're trying to find the verb to hear, and you're asking yourself, how do I say I hear or they hear in Latin? Well, when you get it, you're not going to get one word, and that's where it gets a little tricky. You're going to get 4. So there's 4 different pieces happening here. You're going to see audio, audire, audivi, and auditus, along with an English translation to hear. So the question that a lot of my students ask when we first start diving into Latin is, which one of these means to hear? And I tell them they all have to do with hearing, right? They're just different versions of the verb to hear. So that's where it gets confusing for them, because they're trying to figure out, what do they all mean? Why are you giving me 4 pieces of information? What am I supposed to do with it? It's a little different because, again, if you're a native English speaker, we don't do this. So the idea of getting 4 different pieces of a verb is a little confusing. So let's take them one piece at a time and figure out what they are. So if we come back to that same verb, audio, audire, right? The first piece you get, these are called principal parts sometimes, by the way. And again, they're just pieces of a verb. But the first principal part is the present tense first person singular. So when you look up a verb in a dictionary, that first piece is going to be how you say, I am doing something, right? In this case, if you had the verb to hear, you're saying I hear or I am hearing. It would mean the same thing. Right? So audio just means I hear, present tense, first person singular. The second piece, the second principal part, is always the present active infinitive. So audire means to walk. You can see the re ending makes an infinitive, right? A present active infinitive. It's just how you say in general, to walk, right? Not anyone in particular is walking, just in general, to walk. The third principal part is always the first person singular in the perfect tense, right? So the first part and the third part are doing kind of similar things, just in different tenses. So audivi doesn't mean I am hearing. It means I heard is really what it means, right? It's just perfect tense, so it happened in the past. And last, we have auditos, right? This is the participle form. So more often than not, it's something called a perfect passive participle, but sometimes it's a little different. But it's the participial form. Now, participles are something we'll cover in another video. They're kind of tricky, right, in English because we don't use them a lot. But in Latin, they're really common. So that fourth principal part is actually used a lot. On its own, it could be a perfect passive participle, or it might be used to do different things like passive voice, for instance. But if you were to see auditus here, it would mean having been heard, right? It's a perfect passive participle. And again, we'll kind of pick apart what that is in a later video. And the last piece, of course, is always the English translation, right? So you always get the 4 pieces in the English. So maybe that made sense to you. Hopefully it did. But what are they actually used for? And this is the real question. Maybe you memorize what they mean, but what do we actually use them for? So here's a breakdown of that, okay? The first principal part, right, audio in this case, again, it's the present tense first person singular. It means I hear. This is the most common form of the verb, which is why we give it to you, right? So saying I am doing something is really the most common thing and the simplest thing you can say, really in any language, particularly in Latin, right? So we list it out first. The other reason that we give it to you, though, is when you learn how to conjugate verbs into the present tense, sometimes the spelling of that first person singular, so I am doing something, sometimes it doesn't quite match with what you think it should be, right, or how you're expecting it to be spelled. So we always give it to you. This way there's no confusion. And again, don't worry too much about that now. We'll deal with it in another video when you dive into how to conjugate in present tense. But for now, just understand that we give it to you because sometimes it's a little tricky in terms of how it's spelled. Okay, but that's really it, right? It's pretty easy. It's just given for you. It means I am doing something. So it's a really good starting place whenever you're looking up a Latin verb because it's really the most simple version you can use. The second principal part, again, is the present active infinitive. Okay, so in this case, audire means to hear. So it's important because when you're trying to conjugate a verb, sometimes, let me backtrack. Sometimes an infinitive is important on its own. When you want to say things like I want to hear, or I need to hear, or I try to hear, right? It could be important on its own for something we call the complementary infinitive. But really, what we use it a lot for is when you're conjugating verbs into the present, imperfect, and future tense. All three of those tenses start with the infinitive. So you would start with that infinitive, audire, the second principal part of the verb, and you would drop the re, right? This is what we call the present stem, right? So these tenses to say I am doing something, I was doing something, or I will do something, they all start with the infinitive. So it's really important that you know what the infinitive is because we use it as a starting place for conjugating verbs, right? So it's important on its own. Another reason it's important is it helps us group verbs together. And we've talked about this in a previous video, what a conjugation is, right? It's just a group of verbs. How do we group verbs together in Latin? We do it by how the infinitive is spelled. So again, the present active infinitive has really important uses. One, on its own, you could use it in something like a complementary infinitive. I want to run, right? Pretty straightforward. But a really important one is we use it as the starting point for present, imperfect, and future tense when we're conjugating. And it helps us group the verb and understand which group or conjugation our verb belongs to. So there's a lot of really important uses for it, which is why we put the infinitive there. If you're wondering if it seems a little random, that's why we give it to you. It's a really important bit of information. The third principal part, right, the perfect tense first person singular. If you saw audivi, it would mean I heard, right? That's important too. On its own, it is the perfect tense, right? So if you want to say I heard, right, it's a common thing to say. You'd want to know how to spell audivi. But it's really important for the other three tenses that I didn't mention with the infinitive, right? So to backtrack, the second principal part, like we just said, is for present, imperfect, and future tense. The third principal part is used for perfect, pluperfect, and future perfect tense, right? So the last three. Sometimes this is called the perfect system. All three of those tenses start by taking the third principal part and dropping the long I. That's what we call the perfect stem. Okay, so from there we could add on, whatever ending we need. If we're doing perfect tense, it might be e isti it. If you were doing pluperfect tense, it would be era, mara, sara. And if you're doing future perfect tense, it would be ero, eris, re. But all of them start with that third principal part. That's why it's so important that you know how it's spelled, because it has a unique spelling. Right? It might have a V in the middle or an X or maybe an S, something, but it is unique. So we give it to you. That way you're not always trying to remember, wait, how does this spell? What do I do for these tenses? If you have the dictionary entry, you immediately know how to form the perfect, pluperfect, and future perfect tenses, right? It just makes things a million times easier. And lastly, we have the fourth principal part, right? In this case, auditos, right? More often than not, this is something called a perfect passive participle, but it's really just the participial form, right? Sometimes you'll see future participles in there. But if you saw auditus, it would mean having been heard, right? Again, the participial form is really common in Latin, right? Particularly that perfect passive participle. But it's really not that common in English, right? We prefer to use clauses instead of participles. So for us, right, it's a little tricky to understand what this is doing. But don't worry about it yet. When you get to a point in your Latin career where you're using participles, this will become really important because it's showing you how to spell the participle, which we use for a lot of different things. Okay, so on its own, participle is really important. Another major use, though, that you'll probably see before you really dive into participles is the fourth principal part is used for doing the passive voice. So when you're conjugating perfect, pluperfect, and future perfect tenses into the passive voice, you start with this fourth principal part, right? So you need to know what it is in order to use passive voice. So it's really important, okay? So those are the four principal parts. And like I said, they all have unique aspects to them. They're all important in their own way. And you want to make sure that you understand them before you kind of move on. Okay. So one thing you want to remember, always try to look up verbs in the dictionary, right? When you first see them, make sure you're getting that dictionary entry, because the more you read it and the more you see it and understand it, the more you're going to be able to use it when it comes time to translating or writing Latin, right? It'll help you memorize the forms. It'll make reading and translating easier. Writing, if you want to, write something out in Latin, it just is a lot easier when you have these four principal parts, because they really do unlock a lot of uses for verbs, right? So they're kind of a starting point for really everything you'd want to use a verb for. So it's really important that you understand what they are and why we give you these four principal parts, okay? So let's just do a quick recap, right? The principal parts of Latin. So you want to remember, Latin verbs have different pieces, which we call principal parts. Regular verbs have 4 of them, right? When you run into things like deponents, you're going to see pieces missing, but just your normal regular verb is going to have 4 principal parts. And each part of the verb gives you really important information on how that verb is used and spelled, right? So it helps you with the spelling so you know what to expect and kind of anticipate the meaning and translation of different verbs. The easiest thing to do, again, is whenever you get a new Latin verb, look at all 4 principal parts. The more you get used to that and the more you kind of are familiar with the principal parts, the easier things are going to be for you. 1, you'll probably memorize them by looking at them a lot, but 2, it'll just make your life so much easier when you dive into more advanced Latin and you're using them for a bunch of different things.